Well, welcome everyone to this event sponsored by Christians Against Christian Nationalism. My name is Amanda Tyler. I am Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, or BJC. Before we get started, a few housekeeping matters. If you have questions throughout our event today, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll try to answer your questions as best we can, either through the Q&A or as we have time live. Throughout the webinar, we will also provide links to resources on Christian nationalism in the chat feature. We encourage you to live tweet during this event using the hashtag Christian Nationalism. Since July 2019, BJC has coordinated Christians Against Christian Nationalism. This project is strongly connected to our mission to advocate for faith freedom for all. And it's connected to our experience spanning 85 years now, working in coalition and in collaboration with others across lines of theological difference. We believe that for faith to be truly free, it must be freely chosen, not coerced, promoted, or denigrated by the government. Faith freedom includes the freedom to ascribe to any set of religious beliefs or to choose not to be religious at all. It also includes the freedom to act on those beliefs without unnecessary government interference. Under the US Constitution, that freedom is protected by creating a separation between religion and government that is good for both. It ensures that a multitude of religious faiths can flourish in a pluralistic and interfaith society and public square. If today's discussion stimulates your interest in broader issues on religious liberty in the courts, Congress, and our communities, we have a variety of resources on faith freedom for all on our website, bjconline.org. Nearly 2 years ago, we recognized a need for some common language to understand and call attention to a troubling ideology that was on the rise and that threatens religious freedom for all. Christian nationalism is not new, but the frequency of violent acts inspired by Christian nationalism and a resurgence in attempts to legislate and govern from a position infused with Christian nationalism has been on a dramatic uptick in recent years. We believe that Christians bear a special responsibility to understand and to root out Christian nationalism, not just in its most obvious and extreme forms, but in the pervasive, deeply ingrained manifestations in our culture, our churches, and ourselves. And so, working with a number of other Christian leaders, we developed the Christians Against Christian Nationalism initiative, which can be found at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. On that website, you will find a number of resources to understand Christian nationalism, from a one-pager called What is Christian Nationalism to a 10-part podcast series that I hosted on the dangers of Christian nationalism. This open platform allows individual Christians from across the breadth of American Christianity to show their solidarity with principles of faith freedom. It also allows everyone access to resources to help understand how Christian nationalism threatens both our faith and our democracy. Our latest resource is this very program that you're participating in right now. This webinar with leading experts and faith leaders, whom I will introduce now. You will also see their Twitter handles for your live tweeting. The Most Reverend Michael Curry is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, a position he has held for more than 5 years. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1978 and served as a rector in churches in North Carolina, Ohio, and Maryland prior to his election as the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina in 2000. Throughout his ministry, Presiding Bishop Curry has been active in issues of social justice and reconciliation. He's a frequent speaker at churches, cathedrals, and conferences around the country and internationally, and is the author of 4 books and numerous articles. The Reverend Elizabeth Eaton is the presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, a position she has held for more than 7 years. She was ordained in 1981 and served 3 different congregations in Ohio before being elected bishop of the ELCA Northeastern Ohio Synod in 2006. Presiding Bishop Eaton represents the church in a wide range of ecumenical and interfaith settings in this country and around the world. Thank you so much, Presiding Bishop Curry and Presiding Bishop Eaton, for collaborating in this initiative, and I look forward to our conversation shortly. But first, we will hear from Andrew Whitehead. Andrew Whitehead is the Associate Professor of Sociology at Indiana University, Purdue University Indianapolis. He is one of the country's leading academic experts on Christian nationalism. Last year, Oxford University Press published his book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States, which I can highly recommend as an accessible and incredibly well-researched book on understanding Christian nationalism. And now I will turn it over to Professor Whitehead.
Thank you, Amanda. I really appreciate that introduction. And thank you to BJC and to those also on this panel in this webinar. I really look forward to the conversation and being able to talk through these really important issues at a pivotal moment in our country's history. And so I also would like to recognize my colleague and co-author, Samuel Perry, who is at the University of Oklahoma. This effort was a collaborative effort from top to bottom. And so much of what we have in the book and what I'll share today is kind of a quick overview is due to being able to work with him. And so I'm grateful for him and his work. So a number of weeks ago, January 6th, we saw some really incredible images that in many ways were so shocking. And so if we can move to the next slide. And while they were shocking to see the violent insurrection at the Capitol, in many ways, they weren't necessarily surprising to those of us that have been following along or tracking with Christian nationalism and studying it in the United States. As Amanda shared, Christian nationalism is not new, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But what we saw there was a culmination of the past number of years, and especially with the Trump presidency, where we see groups praying before crosses and then storming the Capitol. Or as you can see on the picture on the left, a Jesus 2020 sign taking place there. So in order to make sense of this riot, while Christian nationalism is not the only explanation, it is a key part of understanding what took place. And so we need to understand how to define Christian nationalism if we're going to confront it, whether it's in our congregations or our workplaces or even in our families. We need to know how prevalent it is and how influential it is on key social issues. So our book is the best way to begin to understand that. And so appreciate Amanda. I'm encouraging you all to take a look at that. But what I'd like to do today is give you some of the key portions of that book to answer some of these questions. So we can move to the next slide. So the big question is, what is Christian nationalism and how do we measure it? So we define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework. And this cultural framework idealizes and advocates for a fusion of Christianity with American civic life. And now the asterisk by Christianity is key. And as we explain in our work, this cultural framework is a collection of myths, symbols, traditions, narratives, value systems that all want to see this type of Christianity privileged in the public sphere. It also includes, though, this idea of Christianity, assumptions about nativism, white supremacy, patriarchy, authoritarianism, and militarism. So the Christianity and Christian nationalism to a certain population means people like us. And the people like us are generally white, native born, and culturally Christian. So it's a cultural package. Now, one thing that many ask is, how is Christian nationalism different from civil religion? And this is a great question. So to just touch on it quickly, civil religion pulls also from religious influences, but from more of a prophetic Old Testament tradition, where they talk about perhaps providence or a creator God that demands justice and humility and public service. And so when we talk about civil religion, we're talking about a civic republicanism that emphasizes strong civic virtue. And this was something that, yes, at the founding of the United States and through our history, many leaders have encouraged. But Christian nationalism is something different. It demands a tribal loyalty of sorts. It is an identity marker. And so it draws on a separate Old Testament tradition, it seems, one of violently defending the group and the tribe against outside influences. It's about subduing others. It's about waging wars, and many times cultural wars, for good. It wants to define the us against a them in all manners. So how do we measure Christian nationalism? Well, in our work, when we survey large portions of the population, we ask usually 5 or 6 questions of our respondents, things that ask them to strongly disagree, to strongly agree with statements like the federal government should advocate Christian values. The federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That we should allow prayer in public schools, or that the United States, the success of the United States, is part of God's plan. And so depending on how Americans answer those questions, how strongly they agree or disagree with those questions, we're able to assign point values and combine them into a scale. And this scale gives us an idea and understanding how strongly they embrace Christian nationalism or not. And so if we move to the next slide, what you can see is that Americans are distributed all across this scale. From at the lowest end with the white bars, these are Americans who strongly disagree or at least disagree with any of those questions, to those at the highest end, the red bars, who are agreeing, or in most cases, strongly agreeing with all of those questions about whether Christianity should be privileged in the public sphere. And you can see below, or on the next slide, that we assign labels to each of these groups, or I hope you can see. To the left are rejectors. And so they're about 22% of the population, the white bar. So these are Americans who completely repudiate any notion of a close relationship between Christianity and American civil society. Resistors are the blue bar, and they're about 27% of the population. They're uncomfortable with the idea of a Christian nation, but they're more undecided than our rejectors. So they are not wholly opposed, we would say, but they definitely lean toward opposition. And in the gray bar, about 32% of the population, this is the largest of the 4 different orientations towards Christian nationalism, we have accommodators. Now, accommodators are in some sense a mirror image of resistors. So they lean towards accepting the Christian nation narrative, this cultural framework. They're friendly towards it. So their support is undeniable, but it isn't comprehensive. And finally, we have what we call ambassadors, the red bar there on the right. And they are just under 20% of the population, a fifth of Americans in the US. And they are wholly supportive of Christian nationalism as a framework. So believing that the US either was or still is, or at least at the very least should be, a distinctly Christian nation in order to flourish. And again, the Christian brings with it a host of different cultural assumptions. Now, one common question that we have or are asked is Christian nationalism confined to one particular social or demographic group or even religious tradition? So over the next 4 slides, what I'd like to do is answer this question to show that Christian nationalism, as we can see on this slide, is not only prevalent across the United States with over 50% of Americans being at least friendly towards it, but it's found in all different sectors of society. So in this slide, we see education levels by these different orientations towards Christian nationalism. So you can see that in all of these, we can find the different orientations towards Christian nationalism. So while ambassadors might have more or a higher level among high school graduates or even some college, they still are a part of, if people go to college and graduate from college or even postgraduate, you'll still find ambassadors in those crowds. You'll see that accommodators for 4 out of the 5 education levels are actually the largest group, mirroring what we find across the population as a whole. So we can't say that this is just among non-college educated Americans. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can see that in different racial and ethnic groups, the different orientations towards Christian nationalism are present. So among whites and African Americans, about 20%, mirroring the population as a whole, are ambassadors. We find that for whites and African Americans. Accommodators are again the largest group there. Among Hispanic Americans, we see again large numbers are accommodators, ambassadors. And so it isn't just found within one racial or ethnic group. And if we go to the next slide and look at region of the country, I'm assuming that those of you who are listening and watching today might assume, oh, this is just in the South or maybe just in the Midwest. But even in the Northeast and in the West, we see these different orientations towards Christian nationalism. But especially in the Midwest and South, you can see that large numbers of people living there are at least accommodators or ambassadors towards Christian nationalism. And so it's prevalent all across the US. And now finally, we can look at this next slide at different religious traditions. And this, I think, is really important for those joining us today, and especially with this group, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, something to think through. If we look at the first four religious traditions here, Evangelical Protestant, Mainline Protestant, Black Protestant, and Catholic, we can see that all of these orientations towards Christian nationalism are represented. Now, in Evangelical Protestantism, we see that almost 80% of Evangelical Protestants are at least accommodators or ambassadors of Christian nationalism, so very prevalent. But even in mainline Protestantism, we see that over 30% are accommodators and just under 20% are ambassadors. So half of mainline Protestants in the US are again friendly towards Christian nationalism. And this is equally well represented in Black Protestant traditions or within the Catholic Church here in the United States. And so as we think of Christian nationalism and how to face it, we have to be attuned to the fact that within Christian religious traditions, Christian nationalism is prevalent and is a part of the people that worship with us or not. Now, does Christian nationalism matter? What influence does it have? So we don't have time to go into a lot of these different hot button cultural issues. And so I will just focus on one today, which is thinking about racial justice, something that the white American church and the American church at large is thinking through, but also our entire society. If we look at these different responses towards Christian nationalism, on this next slide, you can see we asked a question, what percent, and we show here of white and Black Americans believe that Black Americans face a lot, in quotes, of discrimination. So you can see that the white bars are white Americans, and then the blue bar are Black Americans. And across our four orientations towards Christian nationalism, there are a couple of trends that become readily apparent. The first is with the white bars, they go down significantly from one to the next. So only 10, 11% of ambassadors think that Blacks face a lot of discrimination among white Americans who are ambassadors believe this. But when we look at rejectors, many more agree that there's a lot of discrimination. But if we look at Black Americans, no matter how strongly they embrace Christian nationalism, there really is no difference in these groups. So they believe, in spite of, and for these Black Americans who are ambassadors, believing that the US is a Christian nation, they still believe that Blacks face a lot of discrimination. So this should tell us something. Christian nationalism for white Americans, in many ways, blinds them or is part of helping them blind themselves to believing that there is inequality in the US and that Black Americans face discrimination. So if we think back to the numbers of people within religious traditions that embrace Christian nationalism to some extent, you can see how focusing on racial justice would be difficult with that cultural framework in place. And then the next slide, we ask if they believe police reports of brutality towards Black Americans are exaggerated by the media. Here again, for white Americans, the more strongly they embrace Christian nationalism, the more likely they are to agree that these reports of police brutality are exaggerated. But for Black Americans, again, no difference. And so Christian nationalism not only influences how white Americans think of racial inequality in America, but it operates differently among racial groups. So really quickly, in conclusion, we can see that Christian nationalism is pervasive across all segments of US society within different religious traditions as well. And it's influential in shaping Americans' behaviors and attitudes. So we talked about racial justice, but we have work looking at COVID-19 behaviors about what people do and also government restrictions. When we talk about immigration or especially religious freedom, something the BJC cares about, we see Christian nationalism as key. So it is absolutely a threat to a pluralistic democratic society and something that needs to be wrestled with in order to move forward and not repeat the events of January 6th. So thank you, and look forward to the continued conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Whitehead. And there was really an active engagement with your presentation in the Q&A. And so just want to let people know we're responding as quickly as we can there. And some of the questions we'll take live at the end of the session. I did want to say people were really engaging with the slides. And so we are recording this webinar, and the recording of this webinar will be sent to you all and will also live on the Christians Against Christian Nationalism website. So if you were not able to get all that information, you can see the presentation. And again, I would highly recommend Professor Whitehead and Professor Perry's book, from which this presentation was drawn, to see all of those definitions and get all of the other information with regard to that research. But now I'm going to bring into this conversation Bishop Curry and Bishop Eaton. I think have now a really fine grounding in some of the academic research behind Christian nationalism, how we can understand it. But now I want to turn to a more theological and practical conversation, and to really think about how this shows up in our communities, and eventually leading us to a conversation about what we can do about it. So just to lead us off, could you both name some of the theological problems with Christian nationalism narratives? In the church and in the public, we have a broad spectrum of theological perspectives on religion. And so I'm not asking either of you to speak on behalf of all Christians, but from your position, what are some of the most basic theological flaws with Christian nationalism?
Since the beginning of the Christian movement, one of the earliest confessions of faith was Jesus is Lord, which was seen as a direct threat to, at that time, the Roman Empire and the emperors, a threat to the state. And Christians faced persecution because they declared that their primary allegiance was not to any temporal or secular government, but it was to the Lord. So that's a primary problem in all this. And for Lutherans, all of you get out your small catechisms and look up Luther's explanation of the first and second commandments. It's a perversion of how we understand that we're in fact citizens with the saints, and not citizens primarily or ultimately of any one temporal government.
Bishop Curry, what would you add to that?
No, I'd want to affirm and amen that. If you look at the history of Christianity, when it has gone astray, whether it is in support of slavery or silence in the midst of evil against any people, the suppression of people, injustices, there's a consistent pattern that Jesus of Nazareth, his actual his teachings, his example, his spirit, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and goats, the Good Samaritan, that Jesus of Nazareth gets moved aside and suppressed for a broad, ambiguous Christ figure who can be adapted to any cultural context or adapted to anybody's whims. And so it is this Jesus of Nazareth, this Jesus, as Bishop Eaton has said, Christ as Lord, not Caesar. When that Jesus Christ is compromised, we're going to find danger. It is danger Will Robinson at that point. And you see it in Christian nationalism. You've seen it in all the isms where Christianity, whether it has been theological ways of being comfortable with apartheid, whether it was in the Nazi church, whether it has been in white supremacist Christianity, you name it. Every time the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount, the Jesus of the parable of the Good Samaritan, the Jesus who says you shall love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself, on these two hang all the law and the prophets, that Jesus gets suppressed and put aside. So it is a violation of Christianity based on Jesus Christ as Lord from the very beginning. And that begins all sorts of trouble.
Well, and you both point out just how foundational, what a threat this is to the very foundation of our faith. And I think Professor Whitehead showed just how pervasive Christian nationalism is in our culture. And so I'm curious to hear where you see Christian nationalism to be the most prevalent from your perspectives as religious leaders. Where do you see Christian nationalism showing up?
Well, I think it's very important to understand that we are not condemning being patriotic. That's different. Christian nationalism conflates our allegiance and our understanding, and even our relationship with God, with a particular secular state. In the case of the United States, to be a Christian country, and so you cannot, by that definition, be a real American unless you're a certain kind of Christian. And for us, for Lutherans, we number our commandments different. So when there are big arguments about what should be in a courthouse, we don't have to worry about that because we number ours differently. But for us, the second commandment is that you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And Luther said that that this kind of thing of appropriating this is, he said, see, all of this is an attempt to deck yourself out with God's name or put up a good front and justify yourself, my emphasis, or your cause with God's name. And we see that with folks. It's different from patriotism, but when our allegiance is first, and our identity and meaning is caught up in Christian nationalism and not in God, then that's a problem. And we can slip into that very easily. We see this in time of warfare, in time of crisis, and certainly we're in a crisis now.
Yeah, I have to say that I suppose there are innocent forms of Christian nationalism and less innocent forms of it. But I grew up in the Black church. I'm an Episcopalian, been an Episcopalian all my life, but I grew up in a Black Episcopal church. And in my congregation when I was a kid, I remember it was a mixed congregation of Blacks from the West Indies and Blacks from America, but it was a Black congregation. And I vaguely remember some dispute in the early 60s about the flag, because the Union Jack was in the church as well. And I'm guessing that there was a controversy among the those from the West Indies and Americans. Anyway, the compromise was that both the American flag and the Union Jack were both kind of put up on a balcony, so you can see they weren't up front near where the altar was. And I'm guessing that was the compromise. Now, again, that's kind of a nationalism. I mean, but it's more it's more cultural heritage, which is a kind of national. That's probably fairly innocent, if you will. There's the more virulent or dangerous kind that sees my nation, whatever it happens to be, we're number one because we're God's favorites. We're number one. You see what I mean? And that borders on blasphemy, idolatry. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods but me. Whatever the correct number is, that's in the Ten Commandments. And that kind of nationalism is dangerous. It is dangerous to civic health. It is dangerous to the health of Christianity. And it is dangerous to humanity, because when it gets going, it means if we're God's favorite and we're the chosen ones and we're in charge, then everybody else is secondary. And that leads to all sorts of and we've seen that. So Black folk, even if they hold that nationalism, it's probably more an innocent Christian nationalism, because they've seen the danger of Christianity and white supremacy conflated, and they know it when they see it. I think there are other people who have the same discernment because of their experience that leads them to discern the difference between the kind of Christian nationalism that becomes very dangerous quickly, and the kind that, while is problematic, is probably more innocent. We've seen the dangerous kind. I'm just gonna say it. I have always known, I'm 67 years old, been Black all those 67 years. And I have known since I was a childhood that the Klan professed to be Christian. That Nazis in this country professed to be Christian. We grew up knowing that. So we knew there was an unholy conflation of Christianity and white supremacy, and it was often tinged with Americanism. We do that. Dr. King articulated the ideals of America, not that kind of, but the ideals of an America where there is liberty and justice for all, and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and the aspirations of the human soul. That's not Christian nationalism. That's a kind of civic religion, if you will, that is legitimate. It lifts people up. It sets people free. And that is consistent with Christianity. The other is not.
Yeah.
I think I'm impressed that your church handled it so well. I think one of the quickest ways to start a congregational conflict is to move the American flag out of the chancel. In the last parish I served, and they figured it out pretty quickly, but the flag was inside the communion rail, and it was held up by a Boy Scout tent pole, and hastily put up after the first Gulf War, and had bricks, that was the flag stand, and it only had 48 stars. And then it was excommunicating the people around the corner because I couldn't reach them with communion. Not really. So that's people get mixed up. I have a colleague who said to me that he sees it that when the church gathers, that gathered community is an embassy for the kingdom of God, which can be never confused or identified with any other earthly nation, state, ruler, or political party. And another thing that's, I think, perhaps it's been part of the American ethos for so long. There are two myths about America. I mean, there are a lot of other ones, but I'll name these two. First of all, this notion that it was very prevalent amongst Puritans was that God had formed a new covenant with this new nation or their community. A covenant, as a covenantal relationship, that these people would be a shining a city on the hill. We've heard that rhetoric before. The second one was that the founding fathers, and they're very clear about saying fathers, were men who were Christians and a certain kind of Christian. Actually, Jefferson took scissors to scripture, so I'm not so sure. He was one of yours too, Bishop Curry, and he got kicked off the vestry because he could never come to meetings. But then this was intentionally formed, not based on principles that could be found in Christianity, but specifically as a Christian nation, a covenantal relationship. And in this, we will prosper and also be a light to the rest of the world, which is not how we as Lutherans understand government at all.
Well, and I think, I mean, you're both, I think, drawing the history into it and how that's how we understand Christian nationalism. And I think, as we have learned, we can't divorce our American history from the fact that it was founded on slavery, right, on the sin of slavery. And so, you started touching on this, Bishop Curry, but you've both committed to fighting racism, from your particular positions. And I'm just wondering how you see Christian nationalism and white supremacy merging in some cases, and in our project, Christians Against Christian Nationalism, we talk about Christian nationalism providing cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. But I wonder how you all see that, and how important it is to fight Christian nationalism as we also fight to dismantle racism.
Well, 100 years before the first enslaved Africans were brought to the shores of Virginia, land was taken based on the doctrine of discovery. And in that doctrine of discovery, issued by the Pope in that century, it was essentially that if you weren't Christian, you really weren't a person. And so if you were in areas of land where there weren't Christians, that land was now available for the Christians, the Spanish, the French, and the English, to take over, because these weren't people. And so from the very beginning, the notion of white supremacy, superiority, has been part of how this country, before we were in a country, that was part of the myth. And then certainly, I think the Bible has always been used by right and left to justify their causes. But if you take someone look at the justification for slavery, Scripture was freely used, and I think perverted in that way.
Yeah, there was where you can see it, and this is an example from the Anglican tradition. So I'll expose one of our sins. There was a great debate among slave owners, many of whom in colonial America were Anglicans, Church of England, folk from England. And there was a debate, should they baptize their slaves? Should they catechize them, teach them about Christianity, and should they baptize them? And so the question was, the Bishop of London had charge over the Anglican churches in the colonies at the time. And so he was asked about this, and he wrote back, and he solved it by saying that baptism is wholly a spiritual matter and has no effect on a person's civil standing. Well, that was a lie. That was a moment when white supremacy coalesced with a theology interpreting what Paul said in Galatians 3, what Jesus had talked about over and over again, and clearly reinterpreting it for political and economic purposes. That's where white supremacy, and that's a perfect example at the origin of Christianity coming into America. So that you see Christianity was right there being perverted to accommodate itself to what folk wanted to do to other folk, like doctrine of discovery and all of those kinds of things. That has been a pattern. And so, I mean, I would submit that it's a lie. He knew it when he said it. It was a lie. Paul said, all who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There is therefore no more male or female, slave or free, Jew or Gentile. Now you can equivocate and you can segment that all you want. Paul meant what he said. And I know folk have issues with Paul, but that's all right. My grandma said Paul was like every preacher. He had some good sermons, he had some bad sermons. Problem is, they're just all in the Bible. But he was right on that one. And Christianity is, like Bishop said, was distorted to accommodate to the cultural desires. That's perversion. It's a clear perversion, and it is contrary. I keep going back to Jesus of Nazareth. See, there needs to be some standard of what a Christian or what Christianity looks like, and it's Jesus of Nazareth. It's Jesus the Christ. Mm-hmm. As Bishop Eaton said earlier, Jesus is Lord. None of us are.
Well, I mean, I think what a painful anecdote from history, but a perfect illustration of just how Christian nationalism can pervert our faith. Mm-hmm. And I also think about, I'm mindful that we are gathering here today on Holocaust Remembrance Day. Right. And so we know the cost of silence. We have seen it in recent memory. Mm-hmm. And so, why is it so important for us to be speaking out against Christian nationalism now? What lessons can we learn from history? Why is it important? And what would you recommend to members of your denominations and to the larger Christian family about how best to engage on this topic?
Well, we've seen in the last 4 years, and perhaps even a little bit before that, a rise in anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism. And we've seen horrific, particularly in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the largest single massacre of Jewish people in the United States. And also with our colleagues in Islamic Muslim colleagues, that they're facing vandalism and persecution. And one of the tenets of Christian nationalism is you have to be Christian in order to be an American. And on their own website, they say that Islam is a perversion of the Judeo-Christian message and that it is a threat to the United States. That's a very short step to taking torching synagogues and mosques and murdering people. So we can't forget. And for my, here's for my Lutheran folks here, take a look at Luther's Small Catechism again. Very clear. There's God and God alone, and you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And anytime we cross over that line, that's when it gets to be extremely dangerous.
Great. Yeah. Well, now I'm going to bring in Professor Whitehead back to the conversation and ask all three of you, before we move to our question and answer and any last comments we want to offer to our audience. But the question is, what do we do now? What advice would you give to those watching on some concrete actions or steps to take to combat Christian nationalism?
Can I jump in with that? Because I think, remember Dr. King said, darkness cannot cast out darkness, only light can do that. Hatred cannot cast out hatred, only love can do that. we must counter this negative perversions of Christianity and of our humanity. We must counter them with an affirmative, positive way of being Christian. One, I do think Christianity must recenter itself on the teachings, the example, and the spirit of Jesus of Nazareth. I just think that is critical. And I mean the New Testament Jesus, the one in the book, right? I'm not playing with cultural ones, not complicated, the one in the book. And I think I think this is work of positive, affirmative evangelism that grounds itself on Jesus of Nazareth and his teachings. That's one. I think the second thing is, I think we do have to call on affirmatively our common humanity, that we are all children of God, made in God's image and likeness. And that means we're brothers, sisters, we are related to each other. And then thirdly, I think we have to rebuild, and this is where it gets practical. We have to rebuild relationships between people across difference of politics, across difference of race, across difference of religion, and we have to do it intentionally. I've been inviting Episcopalians, and they've been hearing, I say, from many one, we must become e pluribus unum, and we must reach out to people who are different than we are to cultivate at least relationships across difference. And we have to do that affirmatively and intentionally and across that's one very practical thing. Everybody who knows somebody who's different than they are, get to know them. Spend some time with them. Let that become a personal value for your life. And then maybe we can begin to chip away. Everybody won't get on board, but somebody will.
Professor Whitehead?
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. I think too, one big thing that, people that are tuning in today or watching this are taking a good first step is to learn more about it, just to seek out resources to know what it is and how to define it and what it means for our culture. But I think too, in addition to Bishop Curry and what he had to say, I think that those in positions of power that can advocate for the groups that maybe are on the minority groups of all types, whether it's racial or religious or gender or sexuality, that are able to advocate for them and legislate in ways that protect their rights, whether it's religious freedom or otherwise. Because Christian nationalism at its root is interested in power and privilege in the political sphere and in the cultural sphere. And so I think there is a lot of individual level work, but we also have to think too of structurally in systems, because to ignore that just because, creating those relationships are important, but it may not lead to changes that affect whole groups of people. And so I think keeping an eye on that and having our political leaders being aware of this and this threat, I think is important as well.
Sorry, my computer just shut down, so I wasn't boycotting anything.
Well, Bishop, you're right in time, Bishop Eaton. We were just sharing, concrete action steps to take that you might give to people to combat Christian nationalism.
I think, not to put a plug in, but I will for Dr. Whitehead and his colleague's book. It gives a very clear sociologically based, scientifically based definition of what this is. And so to have a better understanding of what this is, and also understand that it's not that this is Christian nationalism is different from being a patriot. God knows I love my country, but my primary allegiance as a Christian is not to my country, but to God. So, but we can still be active citizens and participants in the civil, in the public square. The second thing is Lutherans have this misunderstood doctrine of the two kingdoms or two realms. And we say that, in fact, we believe that government is one of the ways that God provides for abundant life for all people. That government, in fact, is one of the ways that God cares for us. But government is also, any human government, like any human being, is flawed. And so when we talk about the left-hand kingdom of God or the left-hand realm, which is how God governs and keeps the peace, brings prosperity and abundance for all, we have to understand that it's not infallible. And I want to really reemphasize what Bishop Curry said. Sometimes I wish I and I'm trying to break myself of this, like if I wake up at night, I should never check my Twitter feed, never. And the way that people feel free now on social media, but in all kinds of discourse, to say just hateful things and ascribe or attribute a motive to people without any conversation that's killing us spiritually, and in some cases actually physically. So the understanding is maybe now we can say, stop it. But let's consider not just we're seeing the face of Christ in each other, but common humanity. That's going to be so important. I hope that our two parts of the Christian movement can at least start to model that amongst our own people to start with, but then as we interact.
Great. So with our remaining time, we have had quite a few questions, and so we'll just use our remaining time to answer as many questions as we can. The first question is specifically for Professor Whitehead, and this is coming from Kelsey at Deseret News. Is it possible to de-radicalize a Christian nationalist, and what steps do you need to take?
Well, that's a great question. And I definitely want to start first with, this isn't my area of expertise. And so working with de-radicalization or anything like that, I would turn and look to those experts that are working with groups that see this. But I think in some sense, when we look at people that are working to de-radicalize those that maybe embrace white supremacy or different things like that, one thing that they often talk about is that facts and arguments, those types of things generally don't change people's minds. Right. But with what Bishop Curry was saying, focusing on emotions and relationships and building rapport with those people, I think those are key first steps to then be able to open a conversation that would allow you to then share perhaps a little bit about, well, what Christian nationalism is, or the implications that it has, and especially those that are contrary, if you're speaking with somebody who identifies as a Christian, that are contrary to the Christian faith or Jesus's message. Because what we try to do in our work over and over, and what we show, is that Christian nationalism is something different than religiosity or even Christianity in a lot of terms, a lot of ways. A lot of Christians are embracing Christian nationalism, but for those that reject Christian nationalism, their Christianity leads them to very different ends. And so it isn't Christianity as a whole, but it's this cultural framework that has a strong grip within the Christian church, especially the white Christian church in America, that we need to wrestle with. And so I think those relationships and being able to explain that, and as Bishop Eaton has said too, it's not as though we don't want or saying Christians should have no say in civil society or that they shouldn't be patriotic and love their country. I would say that, at least for me, the fact that I'm a person of faith and I love this country, those are reasons why I wanted to write this book, because I see the threat that Christian nationalism is to those things that I care about. And so I think those types of relationships would be key. But again, I would defer to experts in de-radicalization on the whole.
Well, and I think your response is a perfect segue into a question that came from several different people in slightly different wording, but it came to the idea of reclaiming Christianity as a word, and because the question is, has Christian as a label become so polluted or toxic or politicized that it's no longer even useful in the public square? I think for those of us who are leading faith-based organizations, we certainly hope not, because we see a responsibility to engage in the public square. But how do we go about reclaiming a version of Christianity that is more in line with how we read and understand the Gospels and the message of Jesus?
We face this on a regular basis. Evangelical is the name of our church. So we're the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is Greek for the good news. And that was the way that churches of the Reformation were identified in Europe and identified in many places around the world right now. This is the Evangelical Church. But we know that when we say that we're the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, people think of, I think, an unfortunate cultural understanding of what evangelical means. And I think you're right about Christianity. My daughter and son-in-law, when they lived here in Chicago, had neighbors and who were older than they were, and they knew that, they knew what I did, and they knew the kids were very active in their church. And one of the neighbors said, well, how can you tell me about this? I don't get it. Christians are anti-intellectual. We're anti-science. We're judgmental. We discriminate against people. We're anti-LGBTQIA folks. And so that's out there. That's just in the ether. So we need to say, no, that's, let me tell you about how we understand God, how we understand a God who means well for us, a God who is not distant, but became one of us in the flesh, a God who, as one of our bishops said, quoting the Apostles' Creed, went to hell and back for us. And for all people, even those who are not confessing Jesus as Lord, this is for everyone. And, Lutherans talk a lot about grace. I think it's time for us to understand it and live it. God's grace is for everyone, not just for certain people.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Bishop.
Amen. Amen. Yeah, I mean, the reality is Christianity has been held hostage.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We might as well, it has been in terms of public perceptions. And that's what Bishop Eaton was just talking about. It has been. And we must reclaim it. Christianity, you want to know what a Christian looks like? Look at Desmond Tutu in South Africa. That's what a Christian looks like. You want to know what a Christian looked like? Look at Fannie Lou Hamer from the Mississippi Freedom Party. You want to know what a Christian looked like? We have to counter the negative with the positive, because the positive is there. But we must also have to embody it. And that's where some of the things that Dr. Whitehead was talking about in terms of we as Christian people must stand with those who have nobody to stand with them. And therefore, we must speak up and show up when something happens against our Jewish brothers and sisters, against our Muslim, our Sikh brothers and sisters. We must stand in solidarity with them. We must stand publicly for things that don't give us any advantage. That is to be spokespersons for children in this society who are hungry right now, to advocate in the public sphere for what is just and kind and decent and humane. And so we have got to shift the face of Christianity. People have got to see it before they'll believe it. And that's got to happen consistently from us, who are those of us who are Christian, and those of us who are Christian leaders and of our churches. It will only shift. Look, but Jesse Jackson used to say, you can't be what you do not see.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that simple. Folk have got to see a different version of Christianity, and then maybe we can reclaim this faith. Mm-hmm. We've got to speak up and stand up.
And I think that was one of the major driving forces between Christians Against Christian Nationalism, to provide in the public square a different version of Christianity than what perhaps they've seen, speaking most loudly in the public square when it comes to the role of faith and government and how those work together. And, on a related question, just like we need to reclaim Christianity, there was questions about how do we reclaim the language around religious liberty or around religious freedom. And here I would again point to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism project. All of the principles stated in there are core principles of religious freedom for all. It is true that those terms, religious freedom, have increasingly been used as labels for what I would really label as Christian nationalism. And so it's gotten very confused, but speaking up for these principles and living them, right? Not just giving lip service, but living them, I think is very important. A little in the same line here, it was a question that said, considering that people who are, I guess, ambassadors of Christian nationalism, the ones who embrace Christian nationalism the most, see themselves as doing God's work by imposing what they see as God's will, what can the church do to counter that? What is the church's responsibility to counter that perception that those who are, carrying the flag of Christian nationalism the highest seem to have for anyone?
That could be someone's sincere beliefs, but usually it seems to me, and Lincoln spoke against this, that we have God on our side, and that's always dangerous, when human beings decide they have God on their side, as opposed to us trying to be on the side of God. And in our tradition, and Luther would say that if what you're doing is promoting liberty and truth and beauty and health, then take a look at that. And I can't say that Christian nationalism is. And also, I think folks need to read the Bill of Rights again. The First Amendment is very clear. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So it just conflates this, and it does more than domesticate God. It hijacks the gospel when people do that, and we've got to be in a relationship with them. But we need to say it's wrong. It's just wrong, and it's contrary to the gospel.
Yeah.
I'd say, here we are speaking in this rarefied webinar format. There's some practical questions in the Q&A about what about pastors who are out there in congregations and who are, having some trepidation or even fear about speaking out against Christian nationalism. What can we do to encourage or embolden, or how do you speak to that? Because this is an issue, as Professor Whitehead said, that's across all of our society, every region, every denomination, so how can faith leaders who are actually preaching from pulpits address some of these topics, if you have any guidance or thoughts there?
Well, I do think, when Jesus said we must be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves, he was telling, there was a whole lot embedded in that. And he wasn't telling us just to be cagey. He was telling us to be smart, to really be smart. And I think part of it is those of us who preach actually have a pulpit every week. Now, if I get up in that pulpit and I'm on Christian nationalism every week, or I'm talking about Donald Trump, or talking about, if I'm doing, well, that's not smart. It's just not smart. It's not helpful. But if I'm preaching the affirmative Christianity, Jesus said, love the Lord your God and your neighbor as yourself. And you want to know what it looks like? It looks like the Good Samaritan who helped somebody else who was different than he was. Friends, that's what we're about. Preach the affirmative. Go back. I really do believe we have underutilized the Jesus of the Gospels. We've been so busy doing all this highfalutin stuff. We have forgot about the nitty gritty stuff that actually can help folk begin to see this is what it looks like to be a Christian. Go there, stay there, work with it, and then involve folk in a congregation in helping other people, in serving other people. Like that old hymn says, if I can help somebody along the way, then my living will not be in vain. Help them stop wasting their lives and live lives that are not in vain. Do it positively. And then when something negative comes up, when somebody else is being hurt, if God forbid, if something has happened to other brothers and sisters, whether Muslim, Jewish, or whatever, anybody, stand with them. Go and pray with them. In other words, lead folk positively by positive example. There will be pushback. I can't take that away, but you can lead positively. And many people, I believe most people are decent people and want to do what's right. If you lead them and help them, show them the way, they're going to follow. And those who ain't, you can't convert them anyway. Jesus didn't get everybody. So if Jesus, I figure, if Jesus is the baseline, I'm comfortable if I don't get everybody. The point is to be smart and loving and kind and just and humane, and teach us to be that way and show us and help us to do it. That's how you begin to move folk. Not everybody, but a lot.
Yeah.
I want to acknowledge the struggle that is happening between many of our pastors and deacons and members of their congregations, that it is really difficult right now. And shortly after the inauguration of President Trump, it was in February, this woman called up one of our bishops and was complaining that the pastor had specifically chosen a passage from scripture to criticize the administration. And the bishop was thinking, well, what are they doing? What are you doing? And then she finally said, what was the passage? It was the Beatitudes. which is like the fourth Sunday after Epiphany, year B, every year, every 3 years anyways, but it's that fraught right now. So I know we tend to skew a little bit more progressive or liberal as clergy in the ELCA than our people do. And that makes it very hard. And our pastors are walking a fine line. But as Bishop Curry said, I met this incredibly wise pastor who was in her first call, serving in rural Iowa. And she said, it's hard, but I just love my people. I love my people, and not in a certain way like, oh, nice people, but I love my people and I preach the gospel. And it doesn't always go over very well, but she has that relationship. So God bless you, honestly, truly, pastors and deacons and priests serving now in these really fraught times.
Mhm.
Well, I can't believe it.
Blame it on us. Blame it on Michael and me, if you get in trouble with your parish.
Well, our time is gone. This has just flown by, and I just thank all three of you so much for joining us. Thanks to everyone who has joined us on the webinar here today. As we've said, we've recorded this, and it will be available for viewing and for sharing with others who couldn't join us today. I want to say a special thanks to the BJC staff team for all of their work to pull together today's event. And in closing, I would just encourage you all to go to Christians Against Christian Nationalism.org for the latest resources on the topic. We are continuing to update the website. If you have not signed the statement yet, I hope you will review it and join us, and then share the statement with others in your community, asking them to join, and also just using the language to help start the conversations, to help really engage on this topic. It has been centuries in building. It will take a long time for us to dismantle it, but we have our work cut out for it and up for us, and we are ready to start. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.